Okay. Mr. Grindstaff, all I can do is tell you that I believe you have 2 council members who are in favor of option number 4, and myself at least skeptical about 4, but willing to consider it, but it requires a more definitive statement of what value added would mean on this and more definitive examples of what areas might not be covered by this stuff. I'm not prepared to do it because water quality for human health and the environment is one of the objectives of the inherent objectives in the co-equal goal. So it's not a minor deal. It's like water facilities and all the other stuff. Not a minor deal. So I think you're just going to have to use your own best judgment on the 6th draft Delta plan. If I were you, I would have kind of a backup memo you provide independently to staff explaining to council and the public explaining this issue a bit more elaborately and your views of the 2 options that have been discussed.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know if I suggest any policies to you. They're just bad. I'm just tired today, but I know I want a lot more recommendations. I know in some cases there's a difference because I remember the cautious in regulation, but bold in recommendation. So throughout all of these chapters, I feel like we're missing really good recommendations we should be making, and they're free. So people are expecting us to come up with a whole. So I appreciate you trying to do this, but I don't quite understand it well enough to have a strong opinion, and yet I'm not willing to go with 4. Until we know more, so we'll have to just talk about it more.
For whatever assistance that is to you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. All right. The last item, pages 34 and 35, land use in the Delta. Mr. Ray, or Mr. Grindstaff.
I will let Mr. Ray do that. I have business I must.
Yeah, these respond to proposals from the Delta Protection Commission that included very strong recommendations to protect agricultural land from conversion to industrial or ecosystem restoration or flood facility uses. And yet we also recognize that there are some cases where, although agricultural land is one of the defining characteristics of the Delta as a place, that those uses are going to change because we've got to have sites for ecosystem restoration. Some of the best sites are used for agriculture now. There's some flood control facilities that will require use of agricultural lands, and we're not going to be able to have a safe area unless we're able to affect some of those lands with those projects. So what we've tried to do is craft a policy that would follow the Protection Commission's advice as best we can so that we wouldn't be converting agricultural lands for urban uses. So the proposal is that we'd limit the loss of rural lands to the greatest extent practical by locating residential, commercial, and industrial uses, other than processing for local crops, because obviously wineries or other kinds of things often need uses. You need to be located near their sources of supply. That those would have to, other uses would have to be located in current city or areas that current city or county general plans designate for development, either within city limits or their spheres of influence, or else in the legacy communities. And that would create an additional policy for water management facilities and ecosystem restoration and flood management infrastructure, that they ought to do their best to reduce conflicts with existing and planned land uses, and that would include agriculture in most cases, because that's typically the use that's planned for rural parts of the Delta. And that in doing so, they would need to take account of the comments that they'd received from local agencies in the Delta Protection Commission, the Protection Commission being recognized in the law as an important voice for folks in the Delta and local agencies having the land use authority. Okay. The alternatives that we've proposed, option 2, would beef up the mitigation standard a little bit, where facilities had to be located on ag lands so that the proposing agency wouldn't have to just consider the comments of the Protection Commission or the local agency, but they'd actually have to adopt them unless they could find that they were just infeasible or inconsistent with the project's purpose. So it would give those comments a little more oomph in the consideration of a proposed action that would affect those kinds of lands.
Okay.
Or the third option would be that was recommended by the Protection Commission itself, which just said You can't locate these kinds of activities on agricultural lands, and you can only have them on lands that are acquired from willing sellers, and they have to be consistent with local land use maps. So that would give the local government the ability to say, no, you can't have these facilities there.
Okay, Don. Oh, I'm sorry, Randy.
Oh, well, yeah, if I could, and I appreciate Dan's work on this. I would just say that at the commission, we spent a tremendous amount of time looking at this, working with a consultant, hammering out the language that we forwarded, and certainly Dan's expressed to me, some of the concerns from the standpoint of the work that he and Stephen do on behalf of the council. I would just say, though, that on behalf of the commission, that option 3 is, that's where I'm at. And we spent a lot of time as chair of the commission working through this, and the concern in large part is that you would have areas that are outside of certainly the urban setting, where you would go for farmland that, from a habitat standpoint, was where folks said that, either through their studies and or other means want it, and it really does, depending upon where that's located at, it could really begin to impact upon not just the production of that particular land, but again, the fabric of where you have current processing facilities, where you have current farm-to-market routes of transport, and that in addition, that where the state already has a significant inventory of lands already, that ought to be the first priority, and that look to those areas. Now, they may not meet from the standpoint of where folks want to mitigate, either because of species decline and or other considerations, but again, this was a very, very strong position of the commission. And I would just say lastly, and this may or may not be something that this council wants to weigh in on, but this whole idea of willing sellers, because that really is, again, when it comes to a very deep-seated concern of landowners, certainly generally, but in the Delta, because of investigations ongoing for other proposed projects, and whether they be not just habitat restoration, but certainly water conveyance and the like, that this whole idea of the folks, for the greater good, having to just always take it because they're in the Delta, they feel very, very strongly about this. So I would just say that, not that we couldn't look at the language, but that option 3 or the embodiment thereof is something that, on behalf of the commission, but I likewise concur that this is something that is very, very important to the long-term viability of not just the human habitation, but we feel from the standpoint of the folks that have been good stewards and the compatibility of land uses, agriculture, recognizing that the river environment, but also other habitat and floodplain areas, they're farmed in such a way that they're compatible with some of the long-term goals of ecosystem restoration. And I would just, last thing I would say is that it was noted in the Economic Sustainability Plan that some conversion of land would occur over time, and that would be recognized as being something that may not be totally desirable by individuals, but that collectively we recognize that was going to happen, but that the magnitude of some of the proposals that are currently out there and where they want to site them, either in the Delta and or Sassoon Marsh, are conflicting with current general plan approaches to protecting farming and the natural environment as well in the counties and in a number of the cities. So I point that out because it was a very strong point.
Randy.
Whether it's option 1 or option 3, I don't have strong feelings either way. In fact, I would defer to Supervisor Natoli's expertise in this realm, and would probably want to go with the language found in option 3. I would, however, recommend that for the purposes of including this in the 6th draft, that we make it a recommendation, and then have significant time during the debate of the 6th draft to determine whether it rises to the level of a policy or not.
Chris, Randy's procedural question is interesting, just a slight variation on it. Is it possible to frame this as an either-or, so that you are not recommending the decision but presenting the option in the 6th draft?
Sure, we can present. I think there are other issues where you've asked us to come back and present.
Well, what I'm trying to say,
it would be
that's right, because the 5th draft is coming out what date?
Well, the 6th draft should be
19th?
out at the end of at the end of next month.
April, I can't remember the date, 19th or
No
something.
later than the 26th.
Okay.
Yeah.
My concern is that at this late hour, policies have significant ramifications. And I don't think that it's appropriate, given the time that we have, to adequately debate the pros and cons.
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly think at the recommendation level, this makes sense for now. So that would be my recommendation. Throw it in as a recommendation, and then we'll, as we learn more about what this means, as if it were to become a policy, we can address that in the sixth draft.
Yeah. Joe.
I want to point out a couple of things that are significant differences here. Number one, in option 3, it limits residential development, whereas in DP1 it limits residential, commercial, and industrial uses other than processing of local crops. So that's a significant difference. Probably the most important difference is the willing sellers thing, and I strongly recommend the council not adopt a policy that says only willing sellers. I think that would be counter to the co-equal goals, might in fact allow one or two people in key places to block what is clearly in the best interests of the state. I understand the emotional impact of that decision. I've been on both sides of the issue, so I just...
Okay. I'm not opposed to the notion that it come as a recommendation, as long as we reserve the right, after debate and discussion, to suggest possibly later converting it or parts of it into a policy. I do have a suggestion for you, Joe, because this is the classic case of state interest and local interest, both of which are important and significant, and the question is, what is a state agency to do about that when the mandate is the co-equal goal with respect for the delta? So I have a suggestion for you. The proposed option 1, first part, seems to me is pretty much the state option, the state priority of trying to protect lands for both ecosystem and water reliability as best you can. 2, the second part of that, what you call policy number 2, is the respect for local decision making. And of course, Don and the Protection Commission would say, well, the first sentence is okay, but you got to add all the rest too. Is that, Don? Here's what I think you should consider as a possible option. I agree with you also, the notion that you can only do anything on land with a willing seller essentially means that local property owners get to veto state policy. And I'm not going to support that. On the other hand, the sentence that reads in policy option 3, the Delta Protection Commission, in addition, habitat measures must target existing public land, blah, 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 blah. What that really means is you first consider lands that are in public ownership or nonprofit ownership as you venture. Not must. There's a way to write that comes closer to what practically, for all practical purposes, is going to happen anywhere. Dr. Goodwin and all the scientists are going to get in a room somewhere and they're going to mutter incantations and come up with, okay, we know we've got to do mitigation stuff. The best sites look like this. And then they're going to say, well, but there's, I forget what the figure is, Don, 53,000 acres owned publicly land already in the statutory delta, probably another 15,000, 20,000 owned by nonprofits. I forget the figure. So, that's a lot of land. And you guys, all the scientists are going to say, although it's not your consideration, you're going to say, well, yeah, but how different if you start a mitigation program is it if you start over here in a publicly owned situation? Than where you'll have tenant farmers maybe objecting, but not property owners, and you'll come up with a plan that may say 10,000 acres ought to be here, and that's a practical choice. And I'm open to that practical choice of saying, yeah, we'll give a good faith attempt to go to these lands first in an effort to minimize the impact on the local. I don't know how to write it, Don, but the DP suggestion, second sentence of it, but for the word must, is not a bad start for a discussion. And so you and Dan, if you'd give a crack at that. That would be my suggestion of a possible, Randy says, a possible recommendation that could further the discussion and not do total injustice to the issues being raised by the locals.
Mr. Chair, if I just could too, just on the difference between option 1 and option 3 that Joe pointed to, the Commission recognized certainly the aspects of the residential, certainly subdivisions, that type of thing, and yet the reason we talked about commercial and industrial were because of the nature of the viability of not just communities but areas there, and marinas being of a commercial nature, and some of the land side activities go with marinas. Industrial, obviously recognize crop processing, but there are other industrial operations that we're still fortunate to have some manufacturers of agricultural equipment that actually reside with their businesses and their employee base in the Delta. And so I think we looked at that. If there were some expansion of some of those uses, it might very well come out of agricultural land. It might not relate directly to the processing of crops that are grown in the Delta, but would certainly have a strong tie to the economic base of the broader community, and not be opening up industrial parks, so to speak,
Right,
but it would
right.
be those types of activities. So I just wanted to point that out, and Dan and I kind of talked about this a little bit. So
Okay. All right. Who'd like to talk to us?
I would.
Ms. Desjardins, please come forward. I'm sorry. While you're coming up, Ms. Marcus is going to talk.
Yeah, I appreciated what you said, Mr. Chairman. I agree to that. I was going to object. We can't use the word must, and we can't say only willing sellers. It is a complete negation of the police power of the state, and I am not going there. On the other hand, I think it's perfectly reasonable to come up with language that says must first look to or should prioritize or whatever. That part I'm fine with, but I kind of I can understand why someone would want that. But I don't think we can't do it. I don't think we can do it. And I thought the first one was kind of nice. So however you figure out how to take this conversation and come back with recommendations, which I think was a very prudent thing to do at this hour, so we can spend a little time.